Hello everyone and welcome to another Middlegame episode with Coach B and masteryourchess.com. As we concluded the section about how to use the minors in the middle game, we're going to take on how to use the rooks in the middle game. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to create an open file. If you want your rooks to be effective, they need an open file. Without an open file, a bishop or knight might easily outperform the rook, which usually it's going to end up sitting passively behind its pawns. I've seen many players over the years, even in Class B rated above 1600, that make the mistake of waiting to activate the rooks only in the endgame, limiting its potential that it could have in the middle game. Many beginners start something like d4, let's see, d5, e3, knight f6, knight c3, and then just go on from here, developing their bishop, the knight to f3, castling, and playing the game from there. However, this is not a really good setup. First of all, coming back after d5, e3 here is definitely a mistake. Why lock in your bishop for no good reason? We should definitely develop the dark square bishop before we would do that. And after knight to f6, knight to c3 is not the best reply. First of all, it blocks the pawn on the c file, and then it does put pressure on the d5 pawn, but that pawn will be well defended, and the knight won't have much activity there. A much better reply coming back is the pawn to c4. And you could see after something like bishop to f5 and now knight to c3, you could see that this time the pawn on c4 together with the knight put a lot more pressure on d5. Also, it does have the potential after exchanging for the pawn on d5, you're going to create an open file or maybe half open file. The rook then can come to c1, well, it's going to become active and put a lot of pressure on that c file. Here's another example of a weak setup for black this time. If you look for black, it's going to be very hard for him to activate his rooks. Right now, the rook on f8, it's going to take a long time to be able to activate it as the pawn on f7 is blocked by the knight. Also, the rook on a8 will have difficulty opening a file to become active. If we look at white on the other hand, White can play f2 to f4 and open the file now or later in the game, which will activate the rook on f1. And even on the other side, he could play b2 to b4 and then opening that file up, letting that rook on a1 become active on b1, taking control of the b file. So definitely white stands a lot better here. So next, let's take a look at two master games to see how they create open files to activate their rooks and gain an advantage in their game. This first game was played by Jeremy Silman versus Randolph Shane in 1977. Here I'm just going to fast forward through the game and just stop to comment on the key moves of this game. Here Silman plays e4 and Shane replies with the Sicilian c5. And the game continued. This last move, bishop to e3, is one of the key moves in this system. As you will see later in the game, after white will castle on kingside, he's going to want to open up the f file, which will expose the king on the dark squares. Therefore, the bishop on e3 will provide some protection for the king on g1. So the game continued. And you could see here white's plan. He wants to open the f file, so his rook on f1 will become very active. Also, the bishop on e3 provides some cover for his king on g1. After this, the game continued. This last move threatens to take on e7, forking the king and the queen. And if that pawn gets defended, white also threatens taking on f6. And even if the bishop captures back, white will be able to capture in return, doubling up black's pawns. Therefore, black here has to capture on d5, which is technically the real reason that white moved the knight there, because he wants to create a half-open file for his rook. So the game continued with knight takes on d5, e takes d5, bishop d7, and then rook f to e1. Now we could see the point of white's knight to d5. The former e4 pawn has moved off the e file onto d5, where it gains space and frees up that file for its rooks. This allows them to exert tremendous pressure against the e7 pawn. Then the game continued with rook to e8, c3, and then h5. This move was based on fear. Black is worried about g2 to g4 and makes a move to prevent that advance, and also makes f5 accessible to his bishop. However, this move will backfire because Black's kingside is seriously weakened now. So the game continued with rook e3. White intends to double up on the e-file and increase his pressure against the e7 pawn. Black responded with bishop to f5. Bishop takes g7, king takes g7, then rook d to e1. Now white is attacking the e7 pawn twice, which will force two of Black's pieces to babysit that pawn. So Black continued with queen to d7, defending the pawn a second time. And on the first glance, it might seem that Black is getting things under control. However, White will definitely prove him wrong with his next move. And here, White responds with the move bishop to d1. If you look here, Black is attacking the square g4 three times. Once with the pawn, then with the bishop, and then the queen behind. And now White brings another defender of that square to support the g2 to g4 pawn push. White will have three defenders as well, the pawn on h3, the queen on f3, and the bishop now on d1. So here the game continued with queen to c7, and after the g4, the game was pretty much over. The game continued with h takes g4, h takes g4, bishop c8, f5, f6, king g2, king b7, g5, queen c4, bishop to b3 attacking the queen, queen h4, rook e4, queen h8, rook takes e7, check, king f8, queen e4, rook takes e7, queen takes e7, king to g8. Then here the queen took on b7. There is actually a forced mate combination with queen to e6, and I'm just going to play through it. And here Black is mated. However, in the game coming back, White was very happy to take the bishop and gain a winning advantage, from which Black responded queen to f8, rook h1, queen g7, queen takes g7, king takes g7, and after g takes f6, Black resigned. After White wins the g6 pawn, he's up a piece and also up a pawn. He's definitely going to win this game. This next position was reached after 35 moves in a game played in 2007 by Parmesan Neji, rated 25-29, versus Alexander Belyevsky, rated 26-53. If we look at this game, here White is clearly better. His knight has a nice outpost on d5, which is a lot more effective than Black's bishop, which is definitely not doing much. Also, White is putting a lot of pressure on the pawn on b5 with his two double rooks. Here, White can play the position slowly, torturing his opponent, but instead he realizes that Black's king doesn't have many defenders, and that his queen and knight were already putting a lot of pressure in that direction. A real attack might easily appear if his rooks were on an open file and could penetrate into the enemy position. Therefore, why not bust open the b file? So here, White plays an excellent move, a4. Here, Black responded with rook takes a4. I do want to mention that if Black tries rook to a5, defending that pawn, here White can play c4, putting again pressure on the b5 pawn, and also he's going to be able to open up the file. So rook takes a4 was played. Then rook takes a4, b takes a4, and then rook to b8. And now all of White's pieces are aiming at the king, the rook, the knight, and the queen. And the win is in sight. Here Black responded with queen to a6. And here White made a big mistake moving the queen to f6 and later lost the game. However, he has a forced win here. Instead of moving the queen to f6, here White has a forced win after knight to e7 check. Here if Black will respond king to g7 and then knight takes g6. If Black responds with rook to c8, after knight takes e5, White is totally winning. If Black takes the rook on b8, then queen f7 check, king h8, and knight g6 is checkmate. And if Black takes the knight with d takes e5, queen to g4 check picks up Black's rook. And coming back after knight takes g6, the better continuation for Black here would be queen to a7, defending the pawn on f7, also attacking white's rook. Here, white will respond with rook takes f8, a3, rook e8, a2, knight f8. After black queens, which looks scary, white has a forced mate. King h2, queen c1, knight e6 check, f takes e6, queen f8 check, king g6, rook e6 check, king h7, queen f5 check, king h8, queen f6, queen g7, rook e8, king h7, queen f5, queen g6, rook e7, king h8, queen f8 check, queen g8, queen f6, queen g7, and then queen takes g7 checkmate. However, in the game, after queen to a6 and white responded with queen to f6, black here played rook to c8, and now white's attack is over. From here, I'm just going to fast forward to the moves and you will see how black won this game. And here white resigned. Alright, thank you so much for watching this video and stay tuned for more lessons. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.